jump back. He could have said no. He could have said, I'm God's man. I'm God's king. And God's people don't act that way. He could have turned from looking at Bathsheba. But instead, he stepped across the line. And the only place he could go once he stepped over that line was plummeting down, down, down. And where he plummeted to was one big, here's the third point, mess. We got miss, we got kiss, and we got the mess. And what a mess it was. Daytime TV, As the World Turns, General Hospital, all those things that people watch, has nothing on this story. It's as sordid as any soap opera ever hoped to be. David has his fling with Bathsheba and forgets about it until the day that he gets an email. And the email says, gee, he has eyes just like you. You know, there was a mess. And then David muddies the water and makes it even worse. David orders Uriah to come home on the pretense that he needed news from the front. And David tells Uriah to go see his wife, thinking that that will cover everything up. But Uriah is one of those leaders who cares more about his troops than himself. His men didn't get to spend the night with their wives, so neither would he. David tries not once, but twice to get him to go home. Go home, go home. And David's cover-up failed. He would not go home to Bathsheba. Somebody always finds out. So the next thing that David does is send Uriah back to the front. And not just any part of the front, but to the worst part of the front. Leading the war, leading the effort in the worst skirmishes. And sure enough, David's plan comes to fruition. Uriah falls to enemy fire. And the mess gets worse. So you see, David, in trying to cover up his adultery, compounds the mess by doing what? Committing murder. And all of a sudden, just like that, David's wonderful, it's good to be a king life is just one holy wreck. Maybe not on the outside because nobody else knew, but David did, and it began to tear him apart. And that's what happens when we deal with sin in our lives. It eats away at us from the inside out. We run on fear, not on faith. Fear that we will be found out. Fear that we might get caught. Fear that we might have to suffer the consequences of our actions. Fear that we will never be forgiven. The final point all of this leads to is the rest. The rest. In my opinion, though, the rest is the best part of the story because the rest isn't about the miss, it's not about the kiss, and it's not about the mess. The rest is about itself. It's about the rest. The picture we have of David in this chapter is not David the king. It's not David the hero. It's not David the boy wonder, the magnificent musician, or the wonderful poet that we know. Now, the picture we've got here of David is despicable. David is despicable, and that's not an adjective we associate with King David. But he's broken at least 6 commandments, and you just want to slap him upside the head and say, David, how could you be so lame stupid? And you would expect God to do that and boot him out on his back end. And then Nathan. Good old Nathan. Nathan plays such a large part in this story. Nathan the prophet comes on the scene, and he gets in David's face and confronts him. And you think, this is going to be it. This is where the fireworks are going to begin, and there's going to be a big blow-up. But David does something that's totally unexpected. What did David do? David confessed. David confessed to being the reason for the whole mess. He confessed to kissing the miss and making a mess. And the best part, the rest, where we are now, is that God forgave David. Now, David had to live with the consequences of his actions and his decisions. But you always do. They don't go away. God just doesn't erase them. We have to deal with consequences. If you break the law, what do? John Johnson, what happens in court? You have to pay the penalty. If all God had wanted, though, was justice, David would have been zapped. He would have been struck down, and the story would end it there. But thanks be to God, God is a merciful God who can still use even the most broken life, my life, your life, to bring glory to God. David and Bathsheba, though they had to live with the consequences of their behavior, they confessed. And they repented. They turned from their sin and they were forgiven. Why did God do that? Why didn't God do what a lot of times I would do and just get rid of it? Why did he do that? He did it to show that he was a powerful, loving, gracious, forgiving God. I had a teacher, a professor in seminary, and he said something that I think is one of the most profound things I've heard, that David and Bathsheba were forgiven because, and this is my professor speaking now, God is always using sinners because there's nobody else to use. And besides, when God uses us, sinners, God's the one who gets the credit. So, to end, I want to tell you about what a author, a preacher, Bob Russell, wrote a book. And in the book, he's describing a church way, way up north that was building an education wing and re-roofing the rest of the church. And the company that did all this work was the Grace Ice and Water Shield Company. And one day, as the preacher was pulling into the parking lot of the church, he noticed that most of the insulation had been installed, and most of the underroofing had been put on. And every bit of the insulation and pieces of underroofing had the company's name in big letters on it, Grace. There was grace on the roof. There was grace on the side. The church building was literally covered in grace. And you see, that is what the rest is. Not because the church was covered with grace, but because every individual, me, you, all of us, the entire world is covered by God's grace. There's no one so bad. There's no one so mean. There's no one so disillusioned or desperate that cannot find God's amazing grace. Nobody. We can all find it in Jesus Christ. The rest, for us, can take the worst situation possible and use it as a means to show the fullness of forgiveness and grace. That's what David and Bathsheba show us. God didn't want to lose the faith and the creativity of the author of the Psalms. God didn't want to lose the leadership of the one who united the northern and southern kingdoms. God didn't want to lose David, so what did God do? He used him. And God even used the hateful, despicable side of David as well. God forgave him as a lesson for us and for David in grace. And through the grace of God, the lineage of David was continued with Solomon. And the kingdom grew, and the lineage went on, and two others who were heirs of David were married, and they had a child, and the child changed the world, and the child himself was a sign of God's grace. And who was that child? the child was Jesus Christ. You know, this story isn't about David and about Bathsheba. It's about us. Because in a very real sense, we've all kissed the miss. And we've made a mess. Our storylines are different, but they are convoluted. We felt the explosive nature, and we know what it's like to be buried under the rubble of bad choices and the rubble of disobedience. And all any of us need to do when that happens is accept that grace that God gives to us. When we come to know Jesus, as most of us here do, we experience forgiveness. And God's grace rids us of our shame. It rids us of our guilt. And it makes us clean once again. He starts using us. Again, I ask you, why does he do that? Because there's nobody else to work for God except us. And the people at Ottawa Press and at Grace St. Luke's, and every one of them is the same. What does Paul say about humanity? All, not some, not most, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. David admitted his shortcomings and the mess he made. And in Psalm 51, he wrote one of my favorite scriptures. Create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. Can that be our prayer this morning? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our closing hymn is